because this is it's a big conference with a lot of papers, my paper is going to be fairly short, I hope, so that we have more time for discussion. So I want to make 2 points. The first is that I believe there's a great deal of confusion in the way that people use the following terms: radicalization, extremism, violent extremism. And I want to try to bring some clarity to this conceptually messy situation. And secondly, I will try to convince you that, contrary to what is generally believed, radicalization is a virtue and not a vice. So starting with the conceptual analysis. So in recent years, and perhaps as a result of 9/11, the term radicalization has become synonymous with callous terrorism and brutal violence. The implication is that anyone who is a radical or anyone who harbors radical beliefs is seen as a threat to democracy, to human decency, and to dignity. And I think this is unfortunate and regrettable. And as far as I'm concerned, the way the term radicalization is used today in politics is highly misleading. And it's a trigger for all sorts of implicit or unconscious biases. So the problem, I feel, is that radicalization has become synonymous with unjustified violence and with violent extremism. And ultimately, it's become synonymous with illegitimate politics. Now, there are many examples of this, but one example will have to suffice here. The National Institute of Justice, which is in the office of the Justice Programs, which is part of the US Department of Justice, they released a document in 2015 with the title Radicalization and Violent Extremism, Lessons Learned from Canada, the UK, and the US. And the point of this document, which is about understanding the nature of domestic terrorism, is to explain the process of radicalization to violent extremism. So the message here is that radicalization and violent extremism and terrorism are one and the same thing. Now, I think this is, it's a conceptual slippery slope, which is very unhelpful. So radicalization, by definition, is the process of becoming more radical. But being more radical does not necessarily imply violence or extremism, or certainly not terrorism. And if we look at the etymology of the term, radical comes from the Latin word radix, which means root. So the way that radical was used in antiquity was as an adjective to refer to something that was essential. And radicalization was the process of going to the origin. Now, to me, that doesn't seem in any way bad or objectionable. Now, it's only much later in the 19th century that radical became associated with major reforms or change. So it was the idea of bringing about change from the root, as it were. Although initially this idea of extreme reform or change did not necessarily have a negative connotation. It was more used as a descriptive account rather than a normative judgment. And it's only in the late 20th and early 21st century that this has changed. So why is radicalization demonized in contemporary politics. So what is it about being a radical that has acquired this strong negative connotation? So in the aftermath of 9/11, radicalization is a term that is increasingly used to reject anything or anyone who refuses to defend the status quo. So any person or group who's not politically and socially moderate becomes an enemy. And any attempt to enforce substantial changes to the system is frowned upon. Now, I find this highly problematic. Radical changes can occur without violence, and they can certainly occur without acts of terrorism. So the rhetoric on anti-terrorism has been usurped by modern politics to reject any criticism of the status quo. But the status quo today, far from being moderate, is actually very extreme. The status quo today is a place of extreme poverty and extreme inequality, which are the product of the status quo. But one cannot challenge the present reality of structural injustice without being labeled a radical, and by implication, a dangerous political agent. So radicalization is used to delegitimize any criticism of the status quo. So as far as I'm concerned, not all radicals are terrorists. Not all radicals use or justify the use of violence. Civil disobedience, from the suffragettes to the Extinction Rebellion, to the Black Lives Matter movement, they are radical movements. And those who embrace these movements went through a process of radicalization in an effort to bring about much needed change and for the sake of social justice. So radicalization is not what it seems. And this persistent use of terms like radicalization to frighten us from the biggest threat to democracy has turned into a very effective mechanism for silencing and delegitimizing much needed progressive change. So being a radical does not necessarily imply the use of violence. But what if radicalization were to be violent, which it is possible. Now, if someone acts radically, or someone is a radical and uses violence, would that delegitimize radicalization? Not necessarily. After all, and contrary to what John Rawls says, civil disobedience is not, by definition, non-violent. And political violence itself is not always wrong. It is only prima facie wrong. But there are times when political violence can be justified. My friend and late Holocaust scholar Norman Garras once said, and I quote, "Non-violence is a doctrine that would deprive people of all weapons save passive resistance in the face of any oppression or threat, however terrible. And if that is not a sufficient case against nonviolence, I'm unsure what would be," unquote. Okay. So I'm trying to reclaim the term because I think it's been abused, but I want to go further now. And in the time that I have left, I want to suggest that we should consider radicalization not as a vice, but as a virtue, even if radicalization implies, within limits, the use of violence. In 2006, Roland Stout, who teaches philosophy at University College Dublin, he published a wonderful paper with the title, "Can There Be Virtue in Violence?" This is published in the Revue Internationale de Philosophie. And I think it's a paper that did not receive the attention that it deserves. So I'm going to briefly summarize what Roland Stout says and why he thinks that there can be virtue in violence, and why I think his analysis applies to radicalization as well as to violence. So Stout invites us to consider the following thought experiment. He says, if someone attacks you for no good reason, they make themselves your enemy. And in some circumstances, you may then be entirely justified in fighting back, not just to defend yourself, but to inflict serious harm on them. So what he's getting to here is that we accept self-defense as a legitimate reason for the use of violence. And that's because not fighting back would be to allow the status quo to continue. And in the status quo, you are the victim of an unjust attack. So fighting back, according to Stout, is an aspect of virtue in the sense explored by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. So let's go back to Aristotle very briefly. So Aristotle says that a virtuous person is, and I quote from book 4, is angry at the right things and with the right people, and further, as he ought, when he ought, and as long as he ought. Okay, so Stout suggests that the same kind of logic applies to violence. So he says, it's part of being a good or virtuous person that you are willing to fight back in certain circumstances. Now, being too quick to fight back is a vice, and that's a vice of being excessively violent. But being too slow to fight back is also a vice. This is the vice of feebleness. And virtue is achieved as a golden mean. It's being violent to the right degree, to the right person, in the right circumstances. That's what Stout says. So, according to Aristotle, right actions are those that would be done by the virtuous person. And according to Stout, in certain circumstances and in the right measure, violence in the context of fighting back is a virtue. Now, according to me, radicalization is also a virtue, and it's a virtue for the same reason as indicated by Aristotle originally and Stout more recently. And the point is that being a radical, or radicalization itself, is a fighting back strategy. And the desire to change things radically, as in changing things from the root, is necessary because often the status quo is the problem. The status quo is the cause of the initial harm. So not to fight back, not to seek radical change is to give up. And that's not where virtue lies. In fact, I think one may go as far as to say that if we have a moral duty to uphold a just society, and we have a moral duty to facilitate the development of a more just society, then we also have a moral duty to be radical. Okay, so, and I'm going to conclude here, and I said at the start that I was going to keep it short. I've argued the following. To the extent that the status quo is the source of many of our modern problems, as well as the cause of what Johan Galtung famously referred to as quiet violence, radicalization is to be welcomed. And it's to not only to be welcomed, but it should be seen for what it is. It is a virtue, because you are fighting back against something that is holding back a just society. So radicalization conceptually should not be confused with violent extremism, and it should certainly not be confused with terrorism. And this persistent use of terms like radicalization to refer to this threat to democracy and civilization has turned into a very effective mechanism for silencing and delegitimizing what I would consider to be much needed progressive change. Okay, that's my paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bufacchi. I think you somehow shattered our understanding, or many people's understanding, of what radicalization is, its relationship with violent extremism, terrorism, and so on. I think this is all to do good, and I think shattering prevailing understandings is basically what the good philosophy should be. So thank you very much again for your contribution. Although short, although very modest, I think it made quite an impact, I think. So the floor is open to any comment, question.
Qasim?
Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. I have a question about the claim that radicalization is a virtue. So think about the radical right in America, the alt-right or the conservative right. I mean, they're radicals in a certain sense. You might even think of the process of becoming a radical in that sense as radicalization. They would agree from their own perspective with lots of things that you say. The need to fight back, the status quo is the problem, we need radical change. These are all things that you find on the radical right in the US. Now, I myself would then not be inclined to say that that type of radicalization or that type of radicalism is virtuous. So, on the question of whether radicalization is a virtue or not, I mean, supposing somebody thought that, well, it surely depends upon, well, radicalization in what form? Radicalization to what? So radicalization per se is neither a virtue nor a vice. There's virtuous radicalization and there's vicious radicalization, and that which sort you're dealing with is a matter of ultimately of ideological judgment.
Yeah, no, that's very good. Absolutely. So yes, it is the value judgment is what kind of society you want to bring about, of course. So, you talk about extremism as a method, and then it's method, towards what, and it's that will tell us whether it's right or wrong. But I'm going to define my corner, because the virtue is in the political activism. And while I might disagree with their vision, I actually think that there is a virtue in having a belief for what one thinks is right, and actually doing something about it. So it's the vice is in the lack of political interest, the lack of engaging in a conversation about, what is an ideal society, what is a just society. So I think there is, if there isn't, I need to sort of obviously think about this more. Even if there is not a virtue in radicalization, I think there is a vice in accepting the status quo too easily. So I was going moving very quickly from, well, if it's not a vice, then it's the opposite. But no, I take your point. Although you quoted Goldwater on extremism as being a virtue and not a vice. So I'm adding Aristotle to sort of back what Goldwater was saying.
Thank you very much. Then Rita, I see you would like to make any comment?
Yes.
Question?
I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, okay, good. I wasn't sure about these headphones, but I've moved outside, as you can see, because for once it is sunny.
Not here.
I was thinking, it seems to me that what you want to do is to make people take action in a way, and to so for instance, if we think about my presentation and also the one after me, I think you would quite like people to stand up and defend what a just society would be, or what what I call this standard of communication, to actually not just sit there and wring their hands, but to actually protest. And I think that's, that's good. I think you're right, especially if you're in positions of some sort of power. And of course, power is differently defined. If you're in positions of education, for example, you probably ought to do something and not just bemoan the situation. And actually, listening to you, it did remind me quite a bit of Candice Delmas' work on the duty to resist, where of course she also speaks up, and actually not only in favor of non-violent resistance, but also in favor of violent resistance. So if you hadn't read that book already, I thought that might be a useful reference point for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. No, I know her work, and I agree with it, absolutely. The starting point of my analysis, I asked myself, okay, what is the opposite of radical? And I think the word that comes to mind is, okay, if you're not radical, then you're moderate. And I want to actually suggest that there is a different answer. The opposite of a radical, of radical, is not moderate, but the status quo. So the reference point is the status quo. So if I have a problem with the status quo, then the opposite, radical, makes sense to me and can be justified. Now, I don't know if I can actually convince people that, you know, the antithesis of radical is status quo rather than moderate, but that's the way that I was thinking